Hello and welcome to The Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by Spectator TV and broadcast on Thursday, January the 27th, 2022. My name is Freddy Gray. I am the Deputy Editor of The Spectator and I will be your host. On the show, we will be discussing the apparently never-ending crisis that is Boris Johnson. Can the Prime Minister survive? I will be talking to James Forsyth, Katy and Gavin Barwell about the politics of today. After that, we will be moving on to the pressing geopolitical matter of the Ukraine. I'll be talking to Owen Matthews and Dmitri Alperovitch, and we will be asking if Vladimir Putin really is going to invade. And if he does invade, is the West really obliged to step in and stop him? I will be talking to the Fox News host Tucker Carlson. Next up, the markets. There have been highs and lows and a lot of volatility is going on Wall Street and across the global financial system. I'll be talking to Bloomberg's Joe Weisenthal and asking what on earth is going on. Finally, we'll be talking about the etymology of the word based, a word that used to mean getting high on crack, but now has come to mean being fundamentally conservative. I'll be talking to Grayson Quay about what the word based actually means. Before we get going, a reminder that if you like watching Spectator TV, please subscribe to us. You can do that by clicking the link at the bottom of your screen and then tap the bell icon as a reminder so that you never ever miss an episode. And while you're at it, why not subscribe to the Spectator magazine? It is the greatest magazine on earth, after all. You can now get 12 weeks of the magazine in print and online, along with a free £20 Amazon voucher for just £12. Just go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer to take that offer up. First up, the ongoing saga of Boris Johnson's premiership. The Prime Minister is now facing not just one, but two investigations into the various parties and rule breaking that took place in Number 10 during the COVID crisis. I'm joined now by Gavin Barwell, who was Chief of Staff for Theresa May in Number 10, as well as two of our political team, James Forsyth, our politics editor, and our Deputy Politics Editor, Katy. Gavin, I will come to you first. Do you think Boris Johnson's problems have got worse or better in the last week?
My sense is his long-term problem has got worse. If anything, the polling in terms of where the public are has deteriorated a bit. But I think the immediate risk has probably abated slightly.
And why do you think that is?
So I think that the police investigation has helped a little bit. I think the argument around Russia and Ukraine, that this isn't the right time for a leadership election, is having a little bit of traction with some MPs. The 22 obviously backed off changing the rules about how frequently that there can be a no confidence vote. So it seems to me the immediate pressure he's under right now has very slightly abated, but the number of issues that are bubbling away and the underlying anger in public opinion mean that I think his long-term prognosis hasn't changed at all.
James, do you agree with that? I mean, I think it's clear that among the Ukraine issue has made quite a few MPs feel a bit more hesitant about knifing Boris. I'm not sure public opinion would be necessarily the same.
I think the police investigation means that things are going to move more slowly, but they are ultimately more serious. I think one of the best arguments, or one of the only arguments that Boris Johnson's supporters had left was, look, this would be a disproportionate response. This doesn't rise to the severity of things that a Prime Minister should be removed over. It's not the kind of failure of the central policy of his government, which is normally what does for Prime Ministers. But I think the fact that the police are looking at it makes that a more difficult argument to make, because people say, well, you can't say it's small if the police are involved in investigating it. And so I think that does make things more difficult. I think the great... we're recording this on Thursday morning. The great unknown is, when does the Sue Gray report come out and what form does it take? I think if it comes out in something close to its kind of full form, then I think that we will once more be back to a conversation of whether the 54 letters which would trigger a vote of no confidence are hit. But if it comes out in redacted form, or if it doesn't come out for some time, then I think that things will slow down and wait. I think the other thing that is working for Boris Johnson at the moment is he is taking a more kind of, he's coming out swinging. You saw this at PMQs on Wednesday. He's attacking Keir Starmer, and Keir Starmer is not asking the right questions, and so Boris Johnson is showing some fight, which has reassured some Tory MPs. I think that becomes much more difficult once the Gray report comes out, because he will then have to do two emotional registers in the same statement. He will have to both show contrition, but also show some fight, and trying to balance those two things will be a very hard political juggling act.
Katy, the word criminality is used quite a lot in very sort of serious tones. How realistic do you think it is that the Met will find criminal acts have taken place within Downing Street?
So I think it's a strange one this week, because in a way we know very little, but we do know a few things, and ultimately we know that a police investigation has been triggered by evidence that Sue Gray has uncovered. The Cabinet Office sent evidence to the Met Police. That is why they made that announcement earlier in the week, which tells us the report is going to be more damaging than Boris Johnson's supporters thought it would be. A few weeks ago, they were suggesting that there would be no criminality, no evidence suggesting that. Clearly, things are worse than they expected. In terms of where this goes, I mean, I think it's worth pointing out, as many Tory MPs who think they're being helpful to Boris Johnson have, that ultimately, were you found to be found guilty of, breaking the COVID guidelines, it'd be a fixed penalty notice. So there's some saying, well, if Boris Johnson or one of his senior members of his team or his partner had to pay a £150 fine, is that really, the end of the world? But I think it then goes to the point of, well, it doesn't look good if you're being investigated by the police. Is Boris Johnson going to be interviewed under caution? That would be seen as a big step. And how long does it really run on for? So I think it's more about what Boris Johnson has said. Has he misled? And then what is the long-term impact of getting various stories in the coming months of figures in Downing Street being interviewed by the police? But until this report is out and we can see its contents, it's really hard to tell which way this is going.
Gavin, I think some Tories are starting to see a way out for the Prime Minister now, because if he can sort of wriggle out of these investigations to a certain extent and then point towards the declining COVID crisis, take as much credit as he can for the booster campaign and the vaccination rollouts, and look at some signs of good news in the economy, he can start to paint a better picture of his premiership.
Yeah, I think it's clear that the only strategy Number 10 has got here is to play for time, exactly as you said, and hope that as time goes by, public anger is going to abate. I'm personally sceptical about whether that's going to work. I think you can say, well, look, if the police did find him guilty, it would only be a fixed penalty notice. The problem he's got with this issue, it seems to me, fundamentally, is that lots of the things that go on here in SW1 don't really cut through to public opinion. But this issue really has, and it has because everyone relates to it, because everybody remembers what lockdown was like in April and May and June of 2020. And there's huge anger at the fact that the sacrifices people made, and it appears that the Prime Minister and the people that work for him weren't playing by those rules. So to me, you can go through all the sort of mechanics of what's going to be in the Gray report and what the police might do. But ultimately, I think you can add into that equation, are we going to get further leaks from, there's clearly been an orchestrated campaign of leaks, so are we going to get more leaks after the Gray report? But to me, if I think back to my time with Theresa, she had a vote of confidence against her because the main policy that she was trying to deliver was deeply unpopular in the party. She survived that. Ultimately, the thing that made her position impossible was the collapse in support for the party once we hadn't left on the 29th of March. So I think ultimately the Prime Minister's fate is going to be determined by public opinion. And if you look at the polls at the moment, 62% of people are saying he should resign, 25% are saying he shouldn't. His net approval ratings are about the same as Jeremy Corbyn's before the 2019 election. If he cannot raise those numbers, then ultimately the Conservative Party is going to make a change at some point between now and the next election, and the question is when. So, yes, you can play for time, but that only works if you think public opinion about him is going to abate and shift over time. And I am, polls can't tell you that one way or the other, but I'm sceptical because of the way I think this issue really cuts through with so many people in this country.
James, how do you think Tory MPs are feeling? Do you think that they're starting to sense that public opinion might be starting to get exhausted with Partygate and people just want to move on?
Well, as one Tory MP said to me, look, their email inbox has calmed down, but that's, they think, largely because people tend to write in the first 10 days of a scandal. If you haven't written in the first 10 days, you're unlikely to do so. I think the May elections have become even more important for Boris Johnson because that will be regarded as the kind of first electoral test of what impact this scandal has had on the party. I also think that Tory MPs have gone and this is have got to that point where everyone has been very quiet. I was talking to one MP who's been in Parliament since 2010, and they have written their letter, and I asked them if their friends had done so, and they said, I haven't even asked my kind of closest friends whether they have, and they haven't asked me. So there's a real silence there. And also, I think it's also hard to tell the numbers because, there's a 100+ strong support group for Boris Johnson being formed, as all these things are in Westminster these days, on WhatsApp. But there are several members of that who don't really support the Prime Minister. So there's a kind of, people, the polite way of putting it is that the Tory party is the most sophisticated electorate in the world. The impolite way of putting it is that, you don't believe anything about what a Tory MP thinks until you've got kind of 4 forms of independent verification of it. And I think that makes it quite hard to judge the mood at the moment and where things are.
Katy, there's a sort of widespread theory, I think everyone believes it really, that this has been an orchestrated campaign against Boris Johnson, of sort of steadily dripping out details of parties and rule breaking. Do you think there's going to be another big bang, a new revelation coming up that might make the crisis even worse again?
Yeah, I think that is the fear of many MPs, and quite a lot of the MPs who are wavering, who don't necessarily really want to go into a Tory leadership contest right now, would like to muddle along, are worried that what will stop that from happening is this drip of stories, some of which are coming from Dominic Cummings on his Substack, others of which are appearing in the press. And I think this sense that more could come out is worrying people. I suppose it feels as though if, and I think some of the public are getting a bit tired of hearing endlessly about parties, almost the threshold for shock it has to rise. And therefore I think if there was something like a photo, I think that's one thing that's worrying MPs. There's talk that Sue Gray has been passed photos of parties in Downing Street. I think something visual like that could be what brings the story back to life for lots of people. So I think that's a worry, that is something which for some who have calmed down and stopped writing to their MPs is something which further advances it and confirms people's fears.
Gavin, James and Katy, thank you very much indeed. Next up, let's talk about the rather more grave matter of the Ukraine. In his cover piece in the magazine this week, Owen Matthews says that he doesn't think Vladimir Putin is going to invade Ukraine, and we are in the business of phony wars. I'm joined by Owen now and Dmitri Alperovitch, who is co-founder of something called the Silverado Policy Accelerator Institute, based in Washington, D.C. Owen, I think it's fair to say you're sceptical about the reality of the imminence of this conflict. I think you think that Putin would like to invade Ukraine and has intentions to do so at some point, but now maybe not the time. Is that a fair assessment of your analysis?
No, I don't think he wants to invade Ukraine. My argument is very simple, that actually he needs to be extremely desperate if he's to invade Ukraine, because it would be extraordinarily risky and basically an act of economic and political suicide. He may find himself at some future date, in some future circumstance, actually forced to do that if his back is to the wall, but he'd have to be extraordinarily desperate. Right now he's doing a different thing. Kiev is essentially something of a bystander in this process. Putin's message is aimed towards NATO. It's about NATO's engagement with Ukraine. Ukraine itself is not really a player in that process at the moment. Therefore, invading Ukraine will not solve his problem. His problem is he wants to make it very clear and draw a line in the sand that further NATO engagement with Ukraine is dangerous. It's a geopolitical threat to Russia's national security. He wants to demonstrate that that NATO is divided. And most importantly, the most important data point that suggests that he's not planning any kind of imminent invasion is that such an invasion would be a very hard sell to the Russian public. Recent polling shows that 66% of young Russians under 24, in other words, exactly the people who would be expected to fight a war, actually responded that they're positive or very positive about Ukraine. A land war in Ukraine is a very difficult sell. The Russian media are not pushing that line yet. It's a very different situation from 2014, where there was an absolute barrage of stories about alleged genocide against the Russian-speaking population and so on. So for that reason, Putin is not preparing his population for a land invasion. The message, he's insisted many times that he has no intention of invading Ukraine. He's made no demands of Ukraine. He's made no threats against Ukraine. What he's done is he's deployed a large number of Russian armored divisions around the borders of Ukraine. But as the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said on Friday, the situation essentially hasn't changed and has not become more serious over the last year. So it's not entirely clear to me why everybody in the West, and especially among Western pundits, is convinced that that Putin is planning an invasion of Ukraine in February. It's a mystery. He's not in any way talking about it or preparing his people to do it.
Dmitri, if I understand your position, I'm not sure I understand people's positions anymore, but if I understand your position, you would disagree with what Owen's just said.
Yeah, I would strongly disagree. I think an invasion is highly, highly likely to happen in the next few weeks, and for a number of reasons. So one, the deployment of forces that have taken place is really extraordinary and unprecedented. Huge number of battalion tactical groups have been moved over. You now had a deployment that was unannounced into Belarus, ostensibly for a rapid exercise that was never planned. And the types of equipment that has been moved in, not just the tanks and artillery, but bridge building equipment. You have engineering battalions, you have air defense systems that have been all moved towards Ukraine, where you now basically have a full complement of forces almost ready for a full invasion, at least of eastern Ukraine. And then the other thing I would disagree with Owen on is this preparation of the Russian public. I would say that the Russian public did not want to go to war in Chechnya in 1999. It did not want to go into Syria in 2015. It did not want a war with Georgia in 2008. Despite all of that, of course, Putin had engaged in those conflicts and turned the population around in support of those conflicts, in part because he was able to manufacture pretexts like the one in 1999, where you had apartment bombings that took place all over Russia that were blamed on Chechens. Still unclear whether it was actually Chechens who did it or not, but nevertheless, that instantly mobilized opinion. And I think he can do that again, where potential shelling of a Russian village on the border of Ukraine that you can blame on Ukrainian forces and some deaths taking place would immediately change enough of Russian opinion to justify an invasion, in a way similar to what Stalin did in the Winter War in 1941, where he shelled his own Soviet village and blamed it on the Finnish forces and started the war.
Oh, and I'll bring you in there. Does Putin have to act?
Absolutely not. He's. I find that very strange logic, Dmitri, I have to say. I mean, to say that he has to invade Ukraine because otherwise he'll have to come back with his tail between his legs. He's not asking Ukraine for anything. He's not making any demands of Ukraine. His demands are of NATO. He can invade Ukraine or not invade Ukraine. That doesn't fix his problem, as I said before. The process that he started, I would agree with you that there's the urgency and the prominence and the vociferousness with which Lavrov and Putin have actually made this play about NATO expansion are unprecedented. The message obviously is very familiar. I wouldn't agree with you that the troop deployment is unprecedented or certainly Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, doesn't agree, because he says that the situation is not substantially worse than it was last April, when the last deployment build-up occurred on Ukraine's borders. But the point is that actually what he wants is not in Ukraine's gift, it's in Washington's gift, and it's in NATO's gift. And there's a tremendous amount of things in his arsenal, both diplomatic and practical, that he has to run through before the idea of actually war comes to the forefront in any way, shape or form. I mean, for a start, he's done extremely well from his phony war just by moving heavy metal around inside his own country. He's got everyone's attention. He's got everyone in Washington among the punditocracy very scared. Biden is actually he has offered another summit, which is the kind of superpower theatre that Putin absolutely loves and revels and excels in. Macron has been talking about reviving an EU-Russia summit, which had been shelved for a long time. He's actually got the British Foreign Defence Secretary is due to go to Moscow. He's actually got everyone's attention, and he's demonstrated just by rattling his saber already an extremely important thing, is that NATO is very deeply divided about the issue of engagement with Ukraine. It's united in its message that sanctions, if he does invade Ukraine, will be devastating. They're united in that. But already, just by rattling his saber, he's already demonstrated very clearly that there is deep disunity and deep nervousness among many NATO members, particularly in Germany, about further engagement, much less eventual membership for Ukraine. And that's exactly what he wants. He's already got something for nothing.
Dmitri, do you not think it's a bit odd that the Ukrainian leadership seem much less concerned about the invasion of Ukraine than a lot of people in the West, in London and Washington do?
I don't. And of course, the Ukrainian leadership changed dramatically on this point in just about a month's time, because in early December, they were, at least their military, their defense minister and other intelligence ministers were talking about the fact that Russia is about to invade, and they were talking about the forces that were being deployed and were begging the West for help. And now that we have even more forces rolling in, now that we have the diplomatic track basically going nowhere, and the Russians saying that the concessions that the U.S. side has brought to the table in Geneva and in Brussels during those negotiations are not sufficient, the Ukrainians suddenly are saying, well, there's no threat at all. What has changed? What has changed is that the Ukrainians are starting to realize that the West is not going to be supporting them, that there's no prospect of NATO troops coming to Ukraine's aid. In fact, Western nations, United States and others, are pulling people out of their embassies, and they're very afraid that it's going to cause panic among the Ukrainian public. President Zelensky of Ukraine has a very tenuous control on power. He's very unpopular. His ratings are in the 30s. If Russians do invade, he will fall almost immediately. So he is very concerned about all of that. His main rival, Poroshenko, just got back into the country, despite the fact that he's facing a prospect of an arrest and a trial for treason. That is not an accident. I think Poroshenko smells blood in the water and the weakness of Zelensky and sees an opportunity for him to make a play. And all of this reminds me dramatically of just about 6 months ago, when we had very similar pronouncements from the Afghanistan government of Ashraf Ghani, also saying that don't worry, Taliban is not going to take over the country, and then making pronouncements about how they're not going to take Kabul and there's going to be a fortress Kabul, and then hours later leaving the country. I think we're seeing a very similar situation play out in Ukraine, unfortunately.
Dmitri and Owen, there's a lot more to be said, and it's a very fascinating subject, but unfortunately we have to end it there. Thank you both very much for coming on. It's a great honour to be joined by Tucker Carlson, who is host of Tucker Carlson Tonight. which is a show on Fox News, but also available in the UK or through the Fox News app. And we're going to continue to be talking about the Ukraine. And Tucker, I think it's fair to say you've encountered quite a lot of criticism in recent days, because as far as I can figure out, you are the only mainstream host who is skeptical of the idea that President Biden needs to interfere militarily if Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine. And for that, you have been called a Russian spy, a Russian asset. Democratic politicians have said that you are, your viewers are calling them up to tell them that you're on Russia's side. How do you answer this charge that you are on the side of an evil authoritarian?
With a chuckle. But what's interesting is the presumption in the United States is that it's, terrible to be an asset of Russia, but entirely acceptable to be an asset of Ukraine. And many, of course, in Washington are. The president's own son worked for a Ukrainian company, and the president himself was deeply enmeshed in the internal politics of Ukraine when he was vice president, and of course, still today. And I'm not sure why that's better. No one in the United States ought to be an agent of a foreign power or promoting foreign interests at the expense of America's interests. I mean, in a democracy, it's very simple. The government exists to serve the people who put it in power by voting. And your foreign policy ought to reflect that, which is to say your foreign policy ought to serve the interests of the country. Now, if its ancillary effects are to improve the lives of others, then that's certainly great and virtuous. But if its primary goal is to serve the interests of other countries or their populations, then it's by definition illegitimate. I mean, that's the role of church groups and NGOs, and there are plenty of humanitarian organizations. But the U.S. military, the United States State Department, the White House, the U.S. Congress, even our media exist for the benefit of the United States, period. And they've lost sight of that, and that's the core problem. So the argument I'm making against intervening between Ukraine and Russia, and we already have, by the way, we've sent billions in what we're now calling lethal weapons, as opposed to what, I suppose, but missile systems and small arms and all kinds of stuff to Ukraine and to neighboring countries. We're already funding a proxy war. So why would we be doing that? I mean, is there a vital American interest that serves? Perhaps there is. I haven't heard anyone explain it. And you sort of know if they go immediately to you're working for Vladimir Putin or something. I have like limited interest in Vladimir Putin. I've never been to Russia. I don't speak Russian, much less Ukrainian. It's just not a part of the world that is captured by interest. But even if it had, answer my question. Right? I mean, like, what is the vital interest at stake? And of course, they can't answer it, so they go ad hominem immediately. To me, that's a very obvious sign of their weakness. If you become hysterical when someone asks you why you're doing something, then maybe you're doing the wrong thing.
Well, perhaps there's a certain insecurity about NATO, and particularly in Britain. I know there's a strong desire to sustain NATO, even though the sort of primary purpose of NATO to win the Cold War has gone. And do you think there's a legitimate argument to be said that if we allow Putin to expand into Eastern Europe, into non-NATO powers, then he will be buffering up against NATO powers that we are committed by treaty to support, and America is committed by treaty to support. So it puts Russia and the West at a sort of trigger point that they aren't at the moment.
Okay, well, I mean, I guess, but that would be a voluntary trigger, I assume. I mean, I think it's important, given that the Soviet Union collapsed when I was on my honeymoon. That was 30 years ago. I mean, the full collapse happened in August of 1991. That was the point at which my father worked for the U.S. government waging the Cold War. So that was like the very center of our family's conversations every night. At the very same moment that many of these now Russia hawks are making excuses for the Soviets, I should point out, irony of ironies. But in any case, it was a secular regime then. It's a regime that subsidizes the Orthodox Church now. So maybe that's the difference. I would just a guess. But in any case, at that point, you'd think someone would say, okay, we have all these post-war institutions that have, I think, very effectively, maybe even valiantly served their purpose. They kept the Soviets from invading Western Europe. That's great. I was always for that, always for NATO. But at this point, what is their purpose? Maybe we repurpose them. We have a standing army called NATO, so maybe we do something new with it. But no one ever kind of articulated what the new purpose is. And that's a huge problem. If you have, I mean, this is something that, anyone who covers Washington, where I was for 35 years, sees every single day. These zombie institutions marching forward toward what? No one will ever say. Their original purpose has either disappeared or they failed to achieve it. They've been proven ineffective at doing what they were designed to do, but they continue because they're well funded. That's fine if it's the Head Start program, which was designed in 1965 to raise the IQ of poor kids. It didn't work, but we still have it. But if you have an army, if you have a military alliance called NATO, I don't know, that could be really disruptive unless you have a clear goal. I mean, this used to be a prerequisite for all military action. Define, articulate the goal, make it very clear to all participants. This is what we're attempting to do. Imperial Japan, we will not stop until you proffer and we accept your unconditional surrender. They wouldn't. We dropped the atom bomb on 2 of their cities. Okay, got it. Now you could agree or disagree with what we did, but the goal was never in doubt. It was unconditional surrender. So what is the goal of NATO exactly? To protect Ukraine that's not a member? I mean, the whole thing is so crazy and childish. Anyway, you see the point.
If as some people suggest, one day you might be, if you were president of the United States, would you say let's scrap NATO?
As an instinctive conservative, I'm against breaking things without a good reason. So I think the first thing I would do is assess, so we have this military alliance. It's awfully well funded and awfully well armed, relatively speaking. And is there something useful we could do with that? And I think it would be worth pausing. I've been thinking about this for, fairly intently for 4 years, since Putin, 3.5 years, met with Trump in Helsinki. I was there, and this was a big topic. Like, what's the point of NATO? And I have not met anyone who could explain how we could do something useful with NATO. Does anyone sincerely believe that Western Europe is at risk of being invaded by Putin? Well, if it is, then Western European nations, which I think we at this point can trust to have weapons, should defend themselves. I mean, that's the idea of the nation state. You defend your own interests. You have a vested interest. You have what we call skin in the game, and you ought to defend it if it's worth something to you. And that system has kind of worked fairly well.
Well, I mean, I don't want to sound like a hawk, because I don't think I am. But I mean, I suppose the theory would be, if, let's say, Putin somehow takes over Ukraine, which again is doubtful, he would then be up against the Baltic states, some of which are NATO members. So how would you deal with that? Would you say that if he invades a Baltic state, does that become a different question?
I'm not sure I would deal with. I mean, as from the American, look, I'm an American. I have no other passport. I've got 4 kids, 4 dogs, and a house. I'm not going anywhere. So from my perspective, it's wholly American. And I think every country has a different perspective. That's why I was for Brexit, and each country should be able to represent its own perspective on the world stage. That's like a baseline view for me. So from an American perspective, I would say, is it, given the competing nature of interests, is it in the top tier of interests to prevent Russian expansion in Eastern Europe? I mean, it's not something you'd wish. You want free people to live in freedom. On the other hand, the freedom of people is threatened the world over. There are ongoing border disputes in Africa, a continent that I'm actually interested in, that have been, going on, grinding on, causing the deaths of literally millions for decades. And, that's sad. Nobody wants it to be the case, but is it in our interest to physically prevent it or try to? We also have a terrible record of actually affecting the desired outcomes. We just withdrew from Afghanistan this fall after the longest war in American history. And rather than pausing to ask, why didn't that go as expected? What are the mistakes we made? What are the assumptions that led to those mistakes? We're on to, contemplating an invasion of Russia during winter. Because that works. Anyway,
there's this very interesting.
I would ask the question, like, clearly the threat to the United States and the U.S. our interests, global trade routes, energy, pure military power, relative military power comes from China, of course. And so, to the extent that you are focused on another region, given the size of our military, our attention span, the limits of our budget, you are detracting from that. And so the question is it worth it? And being American, we're not trained to think that way. We imagine everything is a possibility. The world's a menu of endless possibilities. We can do all of it. But the truth is we can't, never have been able to. There are limits of, physics and money and reality that impose on you. And so, of course, I wish Latvia the best. I would feel sad if Latvia ever lost its autonomy, to the extent it actually has autonomy as a NATO member, but whatever. I would say to myself, that's sad. Is intervening, given the realistic possibilities of doing what we want to do, worth it, given that that would detract from the real problems, which are East, not Eastern Europe, but Far East. So that's how I would think about it. I think that's a pretty moderate, sensible, realistic way to think about anything. I don't think that's radical. I certainly don't think it's taking Putin's side. I have no special interest in any of this. I only care about my country.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned China because there's been a lot of talk in foreign policy circles about the Pacific pivot over the last 20 years in America and how America's strategic focus now has to move to the Pacific rather than to Europe, the Middle East and Eastern Europe. And of course, the Pacific pivot does actually challenge China. It does challenge China's ambition. So it does presumably suit China for America to be focused on the Ukraine because it means they care a little bit less about what China's doing in, say, the South China Sea or something like that.
Needless to say. So, and you could, look, I'm not alleging any conspiracy here. I do think there is a feature of human nature that causes, and I think it's innate, that causes people, when confronted with an unsolvable problem, to turn to something else to occupy their minds. And anyone who's been, this is relevant to your viewers who are journalists, anyone who's ever been on deadline for, say, a magazine piece will find himself sorely tempted to rearrange his books by author, because it's another problem to work on as you ignore the problem that confronts you that you actually can't solve. China is a problem that is very hard for the United States to solve. And it's not clear how we do solve that problem. By problem, I mean, sort of giving hegemony over the world to a country that doesn't believe anything really that we believe. It would be a massive change in the way the world operates, in the way that we in the United States live, in the way that you in Great Britain live. Having China in charge of the world would be very different from what we have now. That's a huge concern, a legitimate concern, I think. And we're not meaningfully dealing with it. And I think, you often hear people on the right say, well, that's because they're all taking money from China. Well, yes, that's true. Our former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, who's like a moron, by the way, but got rich, as so many have been, but, got rich effectively making China's case to the American business community. Many others in our diplomatic corps have done the same. So that's a straight up sellout. Hollywood sells out. The NBA sells out. They're controlled by the Chinese government. Everyone knows that. But I think the deeper problem has nothing to do with commerce. It just has to do with the terrifying nature of this threat and our own fear that we can't actually do anything about it. So here's where I would start. Not that I make these decisions, but it's not a question of pivoting east. China has massive influence within our hemisphere. Go to any island in the Caribbean, including the American colonies there. We call them protectorates or some of their colonies. St. Croix, Virgin Islands, for example. All the infrastructure in St. Croix was built by China. What? Why would China be building the airport and the roads in St. Croix? And why are they doing the same in Jamaica and Haiti and virtually every population center in the Caribbean? Also true in South America. Again, this is our hemisphere, which for more than 200 years, we've said explicitly, we will not allow, world powers from across the oceans to control, anything of meaning in our hemisphere. And yet they are. And this is being completely ignored. I never heard anybody mention it. I've just noticed it from traveling a lot. So I would just start there and say, what is this about? Maybe it's totally benign that they're building the infrastructure in Bolivia. Maybe it's not.
Well, also, if you were designing American global strategy, you would think, if you were George Kennan or something, you would think isolating China would be good, therefore splitting Russia off from China would be good. Except for the fact that America's rhetoric at the moment seems to be driving Russia and China together as quickly as possible.
And that is, of course, the effect. I personally believe it's one of the intended effects. But what's so fascinating to me and so repugnant is that clearly there are many people in positions of power in the United States who sincerely believe that we have more in common with China and its government than the government of Russia. Now, this is in no way a defense of the way the Putin government operates. You'll notice I don't live there. I don't care to. I feel sorry for Ed Snowden who's stuck there, et cetera, et cetera. But if we're being honest, and we always should be, we have far more in common with Russia than we have with China. I mean, Russia is a Christian country. No, it's not any kind of evangelical country or morally upright country. I'm not right. But its culture is rooted in Western civilization, which is another way of saying, we never say it, but it's true, Christian civilization and Christianity. I mean, its presuppositions are Christian. Whether it lives up to them, often it doesn't. The darkest period in Russian history was the period when it ceased to be Russian and became Soviet. And, anyway, you see the point. So for our leaders who are very familiar with how both of those countries work, to look at the world and say, we're on China's side, which is absolutely what they're saying, reveals something horrifying about them. Again, you could say, I hate Putin. I hate the way he runs that government. But really, compared to what? I mean, that's the other thing. Compared to what? This is a nasty world filled with, genocidal lunatics at the helm, not simply of 2 or 3 countries, but of a lot of countries. And the only reason they're not committing genocide is because they don't have the power to. But there are a lot of bad people in charge, always have been. So to decide that Putin is the worst of the lot, like, you're lying, actually, or you're totally ignorant.
Well, your bringing up of Christianity and Western culture brings up another accusation that is often made against you, which is that you are rousing the forces of ethno-nationalism. How do you respond when people say that to you?
I mean, that's one of those phrases that the sort of half-wits in charge of the Atlantic magazine throw around without thinking about. Ethno-nationalism? I don't know. I don't even know what my ethnicity is. I'm like half Swedish, half English, I guess. It's not of great interest to me, I can tell you that. I'm an American. I don't think in ethnic terms. I wasn't raised that way at all. And I still don't. And I resist all pressure too. Pressure mostly from the left to categorize myself and everybody as a member of some community or racial group. I hate that shit, and I will never participate in it. So, but I would say what's so interesting is that the same people who are saying, opposing war with Russia over Ukraine is ethno-nationalism are simultaneously making the case that Ukraine is for Ukrainians and that the Russians have no right to enter. So our country, we had 2 million immigrants, unauthorized, illegal, without documents, whatever you call them, come into this country in the last calendar year, 2021, 2 million. That's like 4 times the size of the city of Boston. That's a massive number of people, okay? Even in a country of 345 million. It's a lot of people, unprecedented. And the justification for this is, well, borders are racist. People have a right to go wherever they want in search of a better life. Here, I'm looking at tens of thousands of Russian citizens massed on the Ukrainian border, hoping to get in for a better life. And I'm seeing world leaders say, no, you're not allowed to do that. Ukraine is for Ukrainians. I mean, speaking of ethno-nationalism, why is it, if we can import thousands of Haitians illegally, why is it such a lift for the Ukrainians to just, let several thousand Russians in? Well, obviously, I'm joking, sort of. I mean, of course, I'm joking. But I also think, that's a ridiculous, speaking of ethno-nationalism, what's the largest ethno-nationalist nation in the world? Well, it's their closest ally, China. China is an ethno-state. It's run by and for the Han Chinese. Why do you think the Uyghurs are getting so much trouble? Why do you think that, the Mongolians and the Tibetans? Because they're not Han Chinese. So look, I'm not, you run your country as you want. I'm not really much of a judger, actually. I judge my own country because I live here. But the same people, Bill Kristol was he's like an idiot. Ethno-nationalism, fascism. Okay, got it, Bill. A guy who couldn't even run a small circulation magazine is like, I'm in charge of American foreign policy. Think about what you're saying. It's like, it's ridiculous. And so there are many ridiculous people. I'm ridiculous sometimes. I get it. I have a high tolerance for ridiculousness. It's the seriousness with which ludicrous people are taken that really scares me. We have a big, important country. You can't allow dumb people to act stupidly without, reacting to it. It's like, what? It really freaks me out how mediocre our leadership class is. Not just that they're wrong, but they're like low IQ. It's like Bill Kristol is considered an intellectual. Really, on the basis of what?
Do you now deliberately organise your program to trigger their rage? I mean, for instance, you have No,
I don't. I mean, one thing I do, I don't. And by the way, if I'm being honest, I don't have a great sense of their rage because I don't like the internet. It hasn't made me smarter. I make an affirmative effort to turn off all the garbage devices. I don't own a TV, but I have an iPad and a phone. That's my whole electronics right here. And I turn that stuff off at night and I read books. Nothing crazy, but I read, nonfiction books at night. And so I just don't think the internet has made us wiser or even better informed. And so I don't go on like social media. I'm not on Twitter reading about myself or whatever. So I don't really know what people say. And I'm not that interested. If there's something important, someone I love will tell me and I'll listen carefully. But like, what if David Frum is mad? Like, I worked with David Frum for 6 years. I know David Frum really well. Yeah. If David Frum is mad at me, I mean, fine. You know what I mean? I don't care. Why would I care?
Tucker Carlson, thank you so much for coming on.
Can I just say one thing? I just always think this. I do have some pretty far out views on a couple of different things, but they're not related to anything political. I have really strong views about nature or whatever that are not mainstream views. However, my views on like race or sex or foreign policy are like completely moderate, middle of the road. 10 years ago, my views were not even interesting enough to mention.
Yes.
And my views really haven't changed. So it's just so funny to be like this radical Putin apologist, racist. Like, really? No. I'm much more conventional than that.
What is your most far out view?
I hate drywall. I really don't like unnatural building materials. I really believe in wood, and I'm an extremist on the subject, and I won't live in or spend any time in a room whose walls are covered with drywall, which is like paper covered gypsum. It's a very conventional building material because it's cheap and easy to install, but it's disgusting and it sucks the life out of you. It's just enervating to be in a room covered with drywall. So I just won't. I won't. It's not more expensive to panel a room with, say, pine boards like the one I'm in right now. And so I do. I'm not spending any time in a room with drywall or overhead lighting or anything fluorescent. Like, why would I do that? I really believe in natural building materials. Aesthetics are really important to me. Nature is really important to me. And so I'm just not going to do it. I'm never going to stay in like a hotel room if I can help it. I don't want to. So
I'm afraid to tell you, Tucker, as you probably know, that is your fascistic ethno-nationalism expressing itself.
Well, it's funny. Like, architecture really matters to me. And when we were in Hungary last summer, I gave a speech. I never write anything down. So I was just giving a speech and I just launched into this thing about architecture because I really care about it. And whatever, it's not, I like pretty architecture that elevates the human spirit and not sort of grotesque steel and glass architecture that crushes the human spirit. I mean, it's that simple. It's not, I have no complex or brilliant views on this at all. They're very, very normal views, but I really, really mean it. So I give this speech and like David Frum, what he said to me is like, oh, he's Albert Speer. He cares about architecture. He's a Nazi. It's just, it's hilarious.
Tucker Carlson, thank you so much for coming on Spectator TV.
Thank you, Freddie. It's great to see you.
Please come on again. And good luck with everything. Moving on, are we on the verge of a global financial apocalypse? There seems to be a lot of volatility in the markets at the moment. I'm joined by Bloomberg's Joe Weisenthal, who is co-host of the Odd Lots podcast. Joe, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Great pleasure. There's a big meeting at the Federal Reserve which is going up before we record this, which is going to happen after we record this. And it seemed like it spooked the markets in a big way in the last few days, but they seem to have stabilised. And you have this very odd thing where markets seem to be crashing dramatically in the morning, coming back up, and it's fair to say there's a lot of volatility.
Yeah.
What on earth is going on?
I would say there's really two things going on, and they're sort of getting mixed a little bit, but they're distinct. And so one of these things And I think the last time you and I spoke was probably like almost a year ago. It was, remember, like the meme stock, GameStop, AMC craziness that sort of like gripped American markets. I think that was the last time we chatted. It was basically a year ago. That has actually been deflating ever since our conversation. Basically, our conversation was the top. We peaked it by discussing it. And we've seen that continue to decline, the sort of like retail frenzy in America related to like sort of meme stocks, certain tech stocks, growth stocks, cryptocurrencies has kind of been fading for almost a year now, if you look at the charts. And that's accelerated over the last few months. So that I feel like is its own story, as sort of like animal spirits manias. They go up, and then eventually people want to cash in their gains, and then they slowly come down. Then there is this other element, which is that starting, probably in the middle of last year, inflation in the U.S. Really started to gather steam, clearly picked up. That was last summer, and then by sort of late fall, early winter, it sort of became apparent that it wasn't going to end anytime soon. Some people hoped maybe they're like, okay, we're going to have 2 or 3 months of elevated inflation, then it'll return to something normal. Some point late in the year, maybe around October, November, there was some recognition that it was going to persist for longer for whatever reason. And that's when we started getting noises from the Fed, and they've continued to accelerate. Or it's like, okay, in 2022, it is likely we are going to get multiple rate hikes, and the easy financial conditions that have characterized the environment throughout the pandemic might start to come down a little bit. Some attempt to rein in things, and I think that has hit the market over the last several weeks.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? That when we spoke about it before, the real threat, as far as people who knew about the markets were concerned last year, was retail investing. That there was a sort of retail mania, which essentially means people like me taking a punt on something just because it was a bit of fun, and there was a bit too much money in the system, and it was all flowing towards bets on the stock market from the common man. And actually, what seems to be happening in recent days is that it seems to be, correct me if I'm wrong, it's the retail investors selling off dramatically in the mornings, perhaps thinking about their tax burden or worrying about inflation. And then it's the institutional investors that seem to be coming in and picking the market back up. Is that a fair reading? I
think there's definitely an element of that. It's hard to know. I think there are a lot of non-institutional individual investors who still have religion about, I'm going to buy every dip, but I'm going to, every time the market goes down, just put a little bit more away. That exists. But I think, look, the sort of the person who discovered markets in March 2020, maybe when they were stuck at home and they're like, oh, I'll download an app and start trading. This is probably the first time that this may be one of the first times they're experiencing real downside volatility. They may still be sitting on personal gains that they want to lock in. That is an incredibly powerful force. Like, people have this idea that, like, oh, I'm going to be the hero who buys the bottom and makes a ton of money. But in reality, let's say you invested $2,000 and you ran it up to $20,000. Maybe it's down to $10,000 now. You might be thinking, ooh, I kind of like locking in my gains. That's $10,000 I didn't think I was going to have. Maybe I'll just sell some. And so the psychological impulse starts to turn, and no one wants to be the hero anymore, and people just want to lock in their gains. So I think that's a real thing that's happening right now.
Well, something you see at the sort of the furthest end of this speculative mania, I suppose, is cryptocurrency, which I know you're very interested in. And it seems to me, as somebody who has, as a victim of speculative mania, had a dabble in cryptocurrency, you see this sort of cult-like behavior in the markets, which is, if you don't hold, you are somehow almost sinful. You have somehow betrayed the working man to the system, and that you have to hold, even if you're losing what precious few gains you've got. Do you see crypto as a sort of extension of the mania that gripped the markets?
Yeah, 100%. And I think the way you characterized it as the person who either sells or refuses to buy it in the first place is perceived as almost being a heretic, as being sinful. I mean, the word no coiner exists. It's essentially like the word atheist. And so like you have to like create an epithet to describe the person who refuses to join in. And the stronger ones, the currencies that have held on the best, and all of them have sold, have the strongest cults, have the strongest internal belief systems. And the ones that have fallen the most have like maybe a meme, which is like a very like a poor man's version of a cult. It's just not enough to sustain it. But yes, you see it absolutely where there's extreme disdain. In the Bitcoin community for years, they've had this this term called rage quit, which is when someone who has long been a believer announces that they're leaving the community. And often as one of the early developers, they'll write something long and let's say, Bitcoin is not going in the direction I anticipated when I got into this, blah, blah, blah. I'm walking away from it. And they're like the true heretics. They're lower than in the outer rings, in the deeper rings of hell. They're deeper than the no coiners who never began, the people who saw the light and then walked away. And so there are these extreme cult religion elements, good and bad, sinful morality that sort of like help govern, because in the end, there's nothing there. Look, it's like a stock, right? Like you buy like shares of Coca-Cola. You don't really need people to believe in it because Coca-Cola sells something. It produces earnings, and the earnings in theory flow through to the shareholders. No belief is required to hold it. When you have assets that are almost strictly speculative in nature, or the future is very speculative, the only thing that guides the price is where the level of belief is at any given moment.
Well, finally, Joe, I'm going to ask you something. You probably don't want to answer this question, but I'm going to answer it anyway. It's slightly vulgar. It's a slightly vulgar question. But I imagine a lot of our viewers will be slightly concerned about what's going on in the markets and thinking what they should do. It seems to be a very difficult time to, maybe I'm asking this question just for myself and my limited resources, but what the people you're talking to, where are they thinking that is a safe bet for their money in this very tumultuous time that we seem to be in?
I would start by saying every time seems really hard. And look, 2020 was one of them, and the first half of 2021 are some of the most extraordinary periods for market gains in history. And we had a pandemic, and then we had this the most fraught electoral handoff we've ever had in the United States, which, on paper, you're like, that's not good for markets. It turned out none of it mattered, but there's certainly plenty of reasons why someone might have been scared out. So it's never easy. But look, and I don't, I'm not going to give advice, but I would point out that the sort of like, it's very boring, but the sort of like bread and butter by the index S&P 500, put a little bit of money into each paycheck and not pay too much attention to it. It just keeps going up. And so like, there's a great chart, this fund ARC that was like, just nailed all the tech stocks from 2019, 2021. It just crushed the market. It's now basically over the last 2 years, once again, even with the S&P 500 after outperforming it massively for years, it's just that slow and steady. It seems to work. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, and it's very boring, and no one wants to hear it. And everyone thinks that, oh yeah, well, if I buy now, I must be buying in at the top because that's my luck, right? But it seems to work out okay in the long run for people who have just had the discipline to be boring.
Or you can invest in Warren Buffett's, which I know you've pointed out on Twitter a few times, has outperformed Bitcoin.
He has a pretty good. No one wants to. It's boring and it's not sexy. But these strategies that sort of the experts say work, of just like buy something diversified, it does seem to do okay.
Yeah, if in doubt, buy concrete. That was the best.
Yeah, buy concrete, a little copper, some government bonds, and maybe a company that makes phones. You'd probably be all right.
Joe, thank you so much for coming on. Please.
Thanks for having me.
Finally, we are going to discuss the curious case of the word based. It's a strange word that seems to have materialized online, and I imagine quite a few Spectator TV viewers will be unfamiliar with what it is. But to explain all, I'm joined by Grayson Quay, who is the weekend editor at The Week. Grayson, for the uninitiated, I think I'd probably include me in the uninitiated, can you tell me a little bit about what based exactly means, where it came from, and then we'll move on to the row over it?
Sure. So based originates on the U.S. West Coast in the kind of drug subculture, as it's related to the idea of freebasing or smoking cocaine. So it was originally describing someone who was essentially high on crack and acting very erratic as a result. From there, the next step in the evolution of its meaning was you weren't necessarily high on crack, but you were acting like you were. A similar thing would be tripping or tweaking or wildin' or just, you're crazy, which can be spoken dismissively or with kind of a sense of admiration, right? Yeah. So there was then a rapper who became prominent starting kind of in the mid 2000s named Lil B the Based God, who kind of appropriated the word based for himself and took it to mean being yourself, not caring what anyone thinks, living out loud, so to speak. Oh man, that guy's based, that guy's crazy, he doesn't care what anybody thinks, he's just doing his own thing. And that's what got picked up in the mid-2010s, especially with the rise of Donald Trump in the US, as a sense of being contrarian, of being not afraid to tell it like it is, and not afraid of the condemnation or derision that would draw upon you.
So it became a sort of, other people said the word red-pilled was an expression. It sort of meant something similar to that. I mean, you sort of saw the world clearly from a conservative, or some people would say far-right perspective.
Yes, exactly. It did certainly become associated with the right, particularly with kind of the very online pro-Trump right that's been kind of variously characterized depending on which outlet and which think piece you're reading.
We could probably call it the alt-right, which was a sort of slightly out-of-fashion term before.
Sure, yeah, that's a weird term to me because it depends. Like some people, it just means I don't agree with Liz Cheney, and then to some people it means I'm a white nationalist. So it's a term that to me I've kind of stopped using it because it's just so loaded in different ways depending on who you talk to.
But then, so as the Trump presidency went on, the word based sort of came to be used more and more online, and it seeped a little bit into other media as a way of showing approval. So, if you said something that I thought showed you hated the libs, I would say that's based, and people would like it and chuckle to themselves online. But there's a new revolt on the online right against the word based because they feel it's sort of been incorporated by the normies or by the slightly lame centre-right, say.
Yeah, so based kind of had this sense of being contrarian or being almost trollish, but then it also took on this idea of being based in or rooted in something, that something usually being kind of Western tradition or truth or something, beyond the endless flux of liquid modernity, right? And now what's happened, though, is there's a new site that's launched in the U.S. It's apparently pretty successful. The last I saw, they were getting, six-figure numbers of page views, which is good for a startup, I would say. It's started by two journalists named Brad Palumbo and Hannah Cox, and they call their site Based Politics. Now, what caused the whole stir here is that Palumbo and Cox are both well known as being libertarians. They're both certainly right of center, but they're very well known as being libertarians. And there's this sense that these Koch-funded corporate shills are now trying to appropriate what it means to be based.
Right, and so journalists like the writer Sohrab Ahmari have vowed never to use the word based because it's moving away from a sort of Catholic traditionalist revival and towards the kind of Republican Party of the 1990s. Is that the idea?
I think that is the idea, yeah. If you talk to kind of the post-liberals or the new right or the Catholic integralists or whatever you want to call it, you do get this sense that you have progressivism on the one side and you have kind of right libertarianism on the other side, and that these two ideologies divide the world between them. And they both enjoy painting themselves as the scrappy underdog, right? If you talk to the right libertarians, the government is run by socialists, right? And big government is the biggest problem we have. And then if you talk to the progressives, right, the government is run by right libertarians, and the biggest problem we have is that everything's laissez-faire economics, and we don't care about the poor or about regulating or anything like that. And sort of the post-liberal response to that is that this is a sham fight, as I think G.K. Chesterton put it about the two-party system of his day. That you actually have these two ideologies dividing the world between them. They're two faces of the same coin, two heads of the same beast. And that the true dissidents are, themselves, the post-liberals. So for someone who is part of one of the dominant ideologies, even if it doesn't acknowledge itself as such, to try to paint themselves as based, as contrarian, as rooted in something outside of the here and now, to them is, deeply offensive. Some of them these people don't tend to believe in cultural appropriation as a concept, but there have been plenty of jokes about that. Your culture is, or our culture is not your costume, that sort of thing.
Yes. It's quite funny that the word based should be sort of taken. I mean, it sort of belongs with libertarians, I'd say, because as you pointed out earlier, it originated as a term for getting high. It's not something, a concept that you would naturally associate with the traditionalist, very moral, socially conservative right.
Yeah, I think there is a sense of being iconoclastic, of being a little bit trollish there, that I think helps account for the adoption of the word based by this group that does tend to be more socially conservative and less amenable to kind of moral libertinism. But at the same time, I mean, this is just the world we all live in. Woke is a term that originated also in the black subculture. You have the idea of being canceled. That I remember kind of coming up a few years ago as something that people would say in these very catty Twitter spats. And now, we have prestigious think tanks having symposia about what it means to be canceled. And we have French academics talking about les woke coming to destroy their society.
Grace, finally, can I just ask you, what will be the new word? Have you seen any new words bubbling up on the horizon that will be co-opted by libertarians in years to come?
I'm not sure. I've heard, I think Matt Purple told me this, which I've discovered that your surname has to be a color if you really want to make it at the Spectator World. Gray, green, and purple, right?
You've got the first name almost covered.
Yeah. So he said that he's heard keyed, as in like keyed in or keyed up to something, could be a potential replacement for based. I haven't seen it much yet, so we'll have to kind of see where that goes.
I like it. You heard it here first. And that's it for the Week in 60 Minutes for this week. If you thought that episode was based, or even if you didn't, please subscribe. You can do that by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen and then hitting the bell icon at the top to make sure you never, ever miss an episode. That's it. Thank you very much for joining us. Please come again next week.